Some men offer promises loud as thunder, meant to command the sky. The truest vows, however, are spoken in the quiet of a room. A plain word promise to mend a frayed cuff or pour the warmer cup of tea. This is the story of such a vow, one forged not in peril, but in the gentle, steady heat of a kitchen lamp, between a man who had forgotten the language of tenderness and a woman who taught him to speak it again, one careful gesture at a time. Elias Thorne's world was one of straight lines and predictable silences. The furrows in his small plot of land ran true north to south. The single plate, cup, and fork were washed and dried in the same order each evening. His 5-year-old son, Leo, moved through their 2-room homestead with the same quiet gravity, a small, sad moon orbiting a stoic star. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, a blanket woven from loss and duty. In the evenings, lamplight fell on Elias's large, capable hands as they mended a harness or sharpened a blade, the only sounds the scrape of steel on leather, the whisper of the whetstone. He would look at the empty chair across the small table, then at his son's dark head bent over a wooden block, and the weight in his chest would settle a little deeper. The house was clean. It was orderly, but it was not a home. It was a place a man and a boy waited out the days, a bed made for one, and a hearth that gave off heat but no warmth. The rattle of a wagon broke the evening stillness. It was unexpected, a disruption to the rigid quiet he curated. Elias rose, his hand resting for a moment on the worn stock of the rifle propped by the door before he stepped onto the porch. A tired-looking man reined in 2 equally tired horses, and from the back of the wagon a woman descended. She moved with a straight-backed weariness, clutching a single carpet bag. She was not dressed for this rough land, her traveling clothes neat, but clearly not meant for dust and hardscrabble wrenching. "This is the Thorne place?" The driver called out, his voice rough with road fatigue. Elias gave a curt nod. The driver grunted, gestured to the woman. "She's for you. Hired on as a housekeeper. Paid her passage from St. Louis." He tossed a small, sealed envelope onto the porch. "Papers are in there. She's to help with the child." Before Elias could form a word of protest, the driver had turned his team around and was heading back down the path, eager to be gone. The woman stood alone in the dust, her gaze steady, her hands folded over her bag. She looked from Elias's hard, questioning face to the small boy peeking from behind the doorframe. "There has been a mistake," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "I hired no one." The woman's shoulders, which had been so straight, fell a fraction of an inch. "The agency," they said, the Thorne Ranch. A widower with a young son. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly masked. "My name is Annelise, Annelise Vogel." "That would be my cousin's place," Elias stated, the facts clicking into place with grim certainty. "Another 10 miles east, but they moved on. Last month." Annelise paled, her knuckles white on the handle of her bag. She was a ship arrived at a non-existent port. The sun was bleeding out across the horizon, leaving the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Sending her back into that darkness was not an option. His moral code, the only thing as rigid as his routines, would not permit it. "You can stay the night," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. "The driver will pass through again in a few days." "You can arrange passage then." He held the door open, a stiff, formal gesture. She hesitated, then stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of dust and lavender soap. The small house seemed to shrink, the air suddenly charged with her presence. Leo, who rarely approached strangers, took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide. Annelise knelt, so her face was level with his. "Hello," she said softly. Leo did not answer, but his small hand reached out, and his fingers curled into the fabric of her warm woolen skirt, clinging to it as if it were a lifeline. Elias saw the desperate, silent plea in his son's grip, a cry louder than any sound. The offer of one night's shelter stretched into the pale light of morning. Annelise had slept on a pallet by the hearth, refusing his bed with a quiet but immovable pride. When Elias entered the main room after seeing to his stock, the air was different. The scent of coffee, richer than his own boiled grounds, mingled with the aroma of frying cornmeal. Annelise stood at his stove, her back to him, her movements economical and sure. Leo sat at the table, not silently pushing a wooden block, but watching her, his chin propped in his hands, a small, hopeful boat in the wake of her quiet industry. She turned, a plate in her hand, and her eyes met his. There was no deference in her gaze, only a clear, assessing look. "I cannot pay you for your kindness last night," she said, her voice even. "But I can work for my keep until the stage returns." It was a statement, not a request. He looked at the plate of neatly cooked mush, at the way the light from the window caught the determined set of her jaw. He looked at his son, who was tracking her every move with an unblinking focus. The silence in the house felt different this morning, less like an absence, more like a held breath. "I have no money for a housekeeper," he stated, the words a shield. "I do not ask for wages," she countered, setting the plate before Leo. "Only a roof and safety, until I can make other arrangements." Her use of the word safety struck him. It was a carefully chosen word. She was not just adrift, she was wary. He nodded once. "The room in the back is small. It was my wife's sewing room." He watched for her reaction. She simply inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Elias," the name came out rough. She met his gaze. "Annelise." Later that day, he watched from the barn as she hung their laundry on the line. Her hands, though clearly unaccustomed to lye soap, were deft, pinning his work shirts next to Leo's small trousers. A gust of wind caught the sleeve of one of his shirts, making it reach out and brush against her arm. She stilled for a moment, then calmly continued her work. The simple domesticity of the act was a punch to his gut. He had done these chores himself for 2 years, a grim mechanical rhythm. Seeing her perform them, seeing the line filled with their collective clothing, made the house feel inhabited, and made them feel like a family. The thought was so dangerous, he immediately pushed it away, turning back to his work with a renewed, almost violent focus. That evening, after Leo was asleep, he found her sitting at the table, mending one of the boy's shirts by the light of the lamp. The needle moved with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. He sat opposite her, cleaning a piece of tack, the silence between them companionable rather than strained. His mother made all his clothes, Elias said, the words emerging from the quiet without his permission. Annelise did not look up, her focus remaining on the tiny, perfect stitches. "She must have been very skilled," she said softly. "The seams are strong." He watched her fingers, the way they gently guided the fabric, closing a small tear near the cuff. It was more than a repair. It was an act of care. He felt a strange, protective urge rise in him, an instinct to guard this quiet moment, to keep the harshness of the world from touching the circle of lamplight that held them both. Days bled into a week, then 2. A new routine settled over the homestead, softer and more breathable than the one before. It was a rhythm built for 3. Annelise moved through their lives with a quiet competence that soothed the house's sharp, lonely edges. She never overstepped. Her small room at the back remained her sanctuary, the door always closed at night. But during the day she filled the silence with the soft hum of activity, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl, the rustle of fabric, the murmur of her voice, as she began to teach Leo his letters at the kitchen table. Elias found himself listening for these sounds, his work in the fields and barn now punctuated by an awareness of her presence. His habit of scanning his surroundings, a holdover from a life that required vigilance, began to shift. He no longer just scanned for threats. He scanned for her. He would come in from the heat and find a dipper of cool water left for him on the porch rail. He would notice the fire was banked just right, ready to be stoked for the evening. These were small things, unspoken kindnesses that landed like soft rain on dry ground. One afternoon he came upon her in the small garden patch, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to wrestle a stubborn root from the soil. Her hands were smudged with dirt. A stray curl of dark hair stuck to her cheek. He stopped, simply watching for a moment. He saw not a hired housekeeper, but a woman of immense strength and quiet dignity, a woman trying to plant roots in barren ground. He walked over, took the spade from her hand without a word, and with one powerful thrust, leveraged the root from the earth. She looked up at him, her breath catching. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, held a question. He met her gaze, then handed the spade back to her, hilt first. It was a gesture of trust, of respect. You are safe. You hold the power here. A flicker of something warm and unguarded passed through her expression before she masked it. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. That evening, as she served the stew, her fingers brushed his as she passed him the bowl. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, a current of heat that spread from his hand up his arm. He looked up and found her watching him, her lips slightly parted. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, potent longing. He saw the guardedness in her eyes warring with a yearning that mirrored his own. The silence was no longer companionable. It was a taut wire stretched between them, humming with everything they were not saying. He had offered her shelter, but she, in turn, was offering him something far more fragile, the possibility of a home. The trust between them was a delicate structure built of small, stacked moments. A shared glance over, Leo's sleeping form, the way she knew he took his coffee black, the way he left the heaviest buckets where she could reach them easily. It was a house of careful consent. Before he entered the kitchen in the morning, he would pause at the door, his knock a soft question. Before she tidied his few personal effects on the mantel, she would ask, "Is this all right?" Each question and its answer was another stone set in the foundation. He learned the shape of her hands, the cadence of her breathing, the way she smiled, a rare, gentle curving of her lips, when Leo finally managed to write his own name in shaky letters. That smile was a revelation. It lit her face from within, erasing the weary lines around her eyes. The first time he saw it directed at him, over a clumsy joke he'd made about a runaway chicken, his heart in a painful lurch. He felt a powerful, unfamiliar urge to be the cause of that smile again. The loneliness he had carried for so long was beginning to feel less like a permanent condition and more like a coat he might, one day, be able to take off. Annelise, for her part, found herself watching him. She watched the quiet strength in his hands as he repaired a fence post, the patience in his shoulders as he taught Leo how to whittle a piece of wood. He spoke little, but his actions were a language she was beginning to understand. Service was his love language, she realized, and he was fluent. He served her safety, he served her peace, he served her dignity. He never touched her, not even accidentally, after that first brush of their hands. His physical presence was a constant, solid wall of respect. He would pass her in the narrow hallway with his body angled away, granting her space she hadn't even realized she needed until he gave it to her. This careful distance, paradoxically, made her want to draw closer. The longing was a quiet ache in her chest, a yearning to bridge the small, respectful gap he always left between them. She wanted to know the man behind the stoicism, the heart that beat beneath the shield of duty. She wanted to feel the calloused palm of his hand in hers, not by accident, but by choice. His choice. Her choice. The desire was a revelation, frightening in its intensity, but also deeply healing. It was a desire born not of need or desperation, but of genuine, burgeoning affection for a good and honorable man. The summer heat finally broke in a torrent of rain. The storm rolled in from the west, a bruised purple wall of cloud that swallowed the afternoon sun. Rain lashed against the small house, and the wind moaned around the eaves like a restless spirit. Elias secured the barn while Annelise brought in the last of the laundry, her hair damp and clinging to her temples. Inside, the world shrank to the warm, lamp-lit circle of the main room, but the storm was relentless. A steady drip, drip, drip began from the corner of Annelise's small back room. A dark stain spread across the ceiling boards. It was a minor inconvenience that quickly became a larger problem as the drip turned into a steady trickle. Elias placed a bucket beneath it, the hollow plinking sound a new, unwelcome rhythm in the house. Then came the thunder, a deep, guttural roar that shook the window panes. From the small cot in the corner of the main room, Leo let out a terrified cry. Annelise was there in an instant, her arms around him, murmuring soft words of comfort. Elias watched them, a knot tightening in his stomach. The leak, the storm, his frightened child, it all felt like a breach of the fragile peace they had built. He looked at the soaked floorboards in her room, at the narrow cot where his son now trembled, and at the woman who held him. A decision formed, solid, and clear. This was the midpoint, the moment a choice had to be made. He walked over to them. "The leak is getting worse," he said, his voice low and steady over the drumming rain. "You cannot sleep in there tonight." He looked directly at Annelise, whose arms were still wrapped protectively around Leo. "You will take my bed." She looked from him to the large, sturdy bed in the far corner of the room. Her bed for the night. His room was also the main room. There was nowhere else for him to go. "And you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I will take the floor, by the fire." It was an honorable offer, a practical solution. But it was also a division, a separation. She looked at Leo, whose small face was still buried in her side. She felt the boy's trembling. He needed his father's solid presence as much as her comfort. She met Elias's gaze, her own clear and resolute. This was her choice too. "No," she said softly, but with unshakable firmness. "You will not be put from your own bed, Elias, and your son needs you close. I will take the pallet here, beside Leo's cot." He started to protest, but she held up a hand. "We will all stay in this room, together, for warmth, for comfort." It was an invitation, a renegotiation of their arrangement based on mutual need and trust. It was not a surrender of boundaries, but a conscious decision to redraw them. The air crackled, not with lightning, but with the weight of her words. He looked at her, truly saw the courage it took for her to make that offer, to trust him with that proximity. "All right," he said, the single word a vow. "Together." Word of a woman residing at the Thorne homestead traveled on the wind, reaching the ears of Silas Croft. Croft owned the neighboring spread, a sprawling, prosperous ranch he'd acquired through shrewd and often ruthless dealings. He arrived one afternoon, unannounced, his horse a fine, spirited black that stood in stark contrast to Elias's sturdy work animals. Croft himself was handsome in a predatory way, with a smile that never reached his eyes and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He dismounted and strode onto the porch as if he owned it. "Thorne," he said, his voice overloud in the quiet air. He barely glanced at Elias, his eyes immediately finding Annelise, who was shelling peas on the porch swing. He swept off his hat, his gaze roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I heard you'd acquired some company. Croft, Silas Croft." He directed the introduction to her, completely ignoring Elias. "A pleasure." Annelise inclined her head, her hands never ceasing their rhythmic work. "Mr. Croft." Elias stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Croft and Annelise. It was not an aggressive move, but a clear, solid statement of presence. "What do you want, Croft?" Silas's smile widened, becoming unpleasant. "Just being neighborly." "A lone woman out here," It isn't proper. People talk. I thought perhaps the lady might prefer more suitable accommodations. I have a large house. Plenty of staff. The offer was an insult, wrapped in the guise of gentlemanly concern. He was speaking about her as if she were a piece of property to be traded. Annelise's fingers stilled over the bowl of peas. The air grew tense. Elias's voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. She is not in need of other accommodations. She is here. With us. The words were simple, but their meaning was absolute. She is mine to protect. She is part of this family. Croft's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger in their depths. He looked from Elias's unyielding stance to Annelise's cool, impassive face. He had expected a nervous, pliable woman, easily impressed by his wealth. He had not expected this quiet, united front. A man has to be careful of his reputation, Thorne, Croft sneered, and a woman of hers. He put his hat back on, a gesture of dismissal. Just some friendly advice. He swung himself back onto his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and ill will in his wake. Annelise let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Elias, at the solid set of his shoulders, at the protective fire in his eyes. He hadn't spoken for her. He had stood with her. The distinction was everything. He had seen the predator, and without a word passing between them, had become her protector, not her owner. The fragile trust between them hardened in that moment, forged into something stronger, something that felt unbreakable. The ugliness of Croft's visit lingered in the air long after his dust had settled. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was heavy with it. Leo, sensitive to the shift in atmosphere, was subdued, pushing his food around his plate. After the boy was asleep on his cot, Elias and Annelise sat at the table, the lamp casting a small pool of golden light between them, a sanctuary against the encroaching darkness. The usual companionable quiet felt different tonight, charged with unspoken questions. Annelise's hands were tightly clasped in her lap. She had to break the silence. She had to make him understand. "The man I was supposed to marry," she began, her voice low and steady. "He was like Croft. He saw me as something to be owned, a pretty bird for his cage. When I tried to break the engagement, he did not take it well. That is why I left St. Louis. That is why I answered the advertisement for a housekeeper, halfway across the country. I was not looking for a husband. I was looking for a place where my own two hands could earn my keep, where I could be safe and be left in peace." Her confession hung in the air, a testament to her resilience, an explanation for her guardedness. It was a gift of trust, and Elias received it as such. He listened, his gaze never leaving her face, his expression somber and understanding. He saw the full measure of her courage then, the steel spine that held her so straight. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, not with emptiness, but with consideration. Then he offered her a piece of his own story, a key to the locked rooms of his own heart. "My wife, Sarah. She died birthing Leo," he said, his voice rough with remembered pain. "She was this place. All the light in it. When she was gone, the light went out. I didn't know how to bring it back. For him." He gestured with his chin toward the sleeping boy. "I know how to work. I know how to provide. But the tenderness, I'd forgotten how. The house got quieter and quieter. So did he. Until you came." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were raw with a vulnerability she had never seen before. "You brought the light back, Annelise." The simple, profound admission was more intimate than any touch. He was not just a stoic protector. He was a grieving man who had been fumbling in the dark. She was not just a survivor seeking refuge. She was the woman who had, without trying, lit a lamp in his window. She slowly reached her hand across the table, palm up, an offering. After a heartbeat's hesitation, he placed his own hand in hers. His skin was calloused and warm, his touch gentle. It was not a gesture of ownership or passion, but one of profound, mutual recognition. Two lonely, wounded people, finding solace in a circle of lamplight, their pasts laid bare, their futures uncertain, but for the first time, intertwined. Silas Croft was not a man who accepted rejection. He returned 2 days later, not with sneers, but with a piece of paper and a smug, proprietary air. He found Elias mending a fence near the road, with Annelise and Leo gathering wildflowers nearby. Croft reined in his horse, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Thorne, a word. He dismounted, holding the paper out. "I've been to town. Made some inquiries. It seems a woman matching your guest's description left St. Louis under a cloud of debt after breaking a marriage contract. Her fiancé, a prominent man, has put out a notice. He's willing to pay for her return." He looked pointedly at Annelise, his eyes glinting. "The law is on his side. A contract is a contract. You're harboring a runaway debtor. It could cause you a great deal of trouble." Elias's hand stilled on the fence post. His face was a granite mask, but Annelise could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. This was the social threat, the weapon of shame and coercion. Croft wasn't holding a gun. He was holding her past. "You can avoid all that mess, of course," Croft continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Just let her come with me. I'll see she's taken care of, and I'll make sure the right story gets back to St. Louis. Everyone's happy." He was trying to buy her, to bully Elias into abandoning her. Annelise felt a cold dread, but then she felt something else, a surge of fierce, defiant anger. She would not be a piece of property to be haggled over. She stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt, and walked to stand beside Elias. Not behind him, but beside him. She was a partner in this, not a prize. Elias did not look at Croft. He looked at her, his eyes asking a silent question. "What is your choice?" It was the ultimate act of respect. He was ceding the floor to her. He would follow her lead. She turned her gaze to Croft, her expression cool and unshakable. "There is no debt, Mr. Croft. Only a lie told by a man who did not like the word no. I will not be going anywhere with you. Not now. Not ever." Her voice did not tremble. Each word was a stone laid in a wall. Croft's face darkened with fury. He turned on Elias. "Are you going to let her make this mistake, Thorne? This affects you, your land, your boy." Elias placed a hand on the top of the fence post, a simple, grounding gesture. His voice, when it came, was as solid and unmovable as the earth beneath his feet. "You heard her," he said. "Her choice is ours." That was it. The plainest of vows. Ours. The word hung in the air, a shield forged of trust and unity. It was a decisive, non-violent confrontation that had nothing to do with fists and everything to do with character. In that moment, facing down the predator together, they were no longer just a man and a woman in a practical arrangement. They were a family, choosing each other right there under the wide, unforgiving sky. After a moment of sputtering disbelief, Silas Croft remounted his horse and rode away, defeated not by violence, but by a quiet, unbreakable solidarity. The immediate threat was gone, but the tension remained, a humming in the air. Annelise looked down at her hands and was surprised to find them trembling. The adrenaline of the confrontation receded, leaving a shaky vulnerability in its wake. She had been so strong, so certain, but the effort had cost her. She began to gather the wildflowers she had dropped, her movements jerky. In her haste, the sharp edge of a thistle she hadn't noticed pricked her thumb. A tiny, perfect bead of red welled up on the pad of her finger. "Ah," she breathed, a small, involuntary sound of pain. Elias was beside her in an instant. "Let me see," he said, his voice low and gentle. He took her hand, his touch infinitely careful, and examined the small wound. His thumb, calloused and wide, brushed against her palm, sending a tremor of a different kind through her. He led her back to the house, to the kitchen, and sat her down at the table. He fetched a clean cloth and a basin of water. With a concentration more intense than any he gave to mending a harness, he gently washed the dirt from her hand and pressed the cloth to the tiny cut. The world narrowed to the feeling of his large, warm hands holding hers. It was an act of such profound, simple tenderness aftercare for a wound not of the body, but of the soul. He held her hand for a moment longer than was necessary, his gaze fixed on their joined fingers. The silence in the kitchen was soft and healing. He released her hand and moved to the stove to make tea, his movements deliberate. He brought 2 mugs to the table, setting the one that was slightly fuller in front of her. He broke off a piece of the bread she had baked that morning and held it out to her. It was a simple offering sustenance, care, a wordless promise to replenish what the confrontation had taken from her. She took it, their fingers brushing. She looked at him, at his serious, gentle face illuminated by the afternoon light slanting through the window, and her heart felt so full it ached. In the lamplight of the kitchen, they had shared their pasts. In the harsh light of day, they had chosen a future. And now, in the soft afternoon glow, they tended to the present, a quiet, intimate ritual of care that sealed their unspoken bond more surely than any kiss. The temporary arrangement had been irrevocably broken. Croft's intrusion had forced a truth into the open. This was no longer a matter of convenience. It was a matter of the heart. That evening, after Leo was asleep, the air between Elias and Annelise was different. The careful distance was gone, replaced by a quiet, resonant intimacy. They sat not opposite each other, but side by side at the kitchen table, their shoulders almost touching. Elias turned to her, his expression serious, his gaze direct. "Annelise," he began, his voice a low rumble. "What you said to Croft, that your place is here. Did you mean it?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I have never meant anything more." He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, as if absorbing the weight and wonder of her words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was smooth from handling, the details of its feathers rendered with a patient, loving hand. "I made this for Leo," he said, turning it over in his palm, "to teach him that even small things can have the strength to fly, that they can find their way home." He held it out to her. "I think it was always meant for you." She took the bird, its smooth wood warm from his touch. It was a symbol of everything he was, strong, patient, capable of creating delicate beauty. "Elias," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "I want to build a life here," he said, his words plain and direct, more powerful than any flowery prose. "With you. I want to see you in the garden. I want to hear you reading to Leo. I want you to be my partner, my wife, if you will have us." He did not say, "Will you be mine?" He said, "Will you have us?" An offering, not a claim. A question, not a demand. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the concerned, hopeful lines of his face. "Yes," she said, the word a quiet breath of release and homecoming. "Yes, Elias, I will." They did not seal their promise with a grand embrace. Instead, she stood, went to her sewing basket, and returned with a shirt of his she had been mending. She had finished it, the tear near the cuff gone, replaced by a line of stitches so neat they were nearly invisible. She had also, she now revealed, stitched his initials A.T. in dark blue thread just inside the collar. It was a small, intimate mark of belonging. She handed it to him. "A home needs mending too," she said softly, "and a family needs its name." He took the shirt, his fingers tracing the letters she had sewn. It was a token for a token, a promise for a promise, a shared future, stitched together with care and sealed in the quiet glow of the kitchen lamplight. The next morning, Annelise rose and went not to her small room, but to the larger bed where Elias lay watching her. She slipped in beside him, and he drew the quilt over her, his arms settling around her shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and profoundly comforting. There was a rightness to it, a sense of a final puzzle piece clicking into place. The space that had been empty for so long was now filled with her warmth, her steady breathing a soft counterpoint to his own. Down on his cot, Leo stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. He saw them there, together in the big bed, and a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy, the smile of a child who has found his harbor. That smile was the only benediction they needed. The days that followed settled into a new, permanent rhythm. The routines were the same: milking the cow, tending the garden, mending clothes, but they were different now, imbued with a shared purpose. They were no longer the solitary actions of individuals, but the collaborative work of a family. They moved around each other in the small house with an easy, familiar grace, their hands brushing as they passed, their glances meeting in moments of quiet understanding. One afternoon, Elias was teaching Leo how to hammer a nail into a loose board on the porch. He held the nail steady while Leo, his face a mask of concentration, swung the heavy hammer. Annelise watched from the doorway, her heart swelling. This was it. This was the peace she had been searching for. Not a life free of hardship, but one filled with shared labor, shared laughter, and a love as solid and dependable as the man showing his son how to build. She brought out a pitcher of lemonade, and they sat together on the steps, the three of them, a small, unlikely constellation that had finally found its alignment. Elias's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. It felt natural, inevitable. He looked at the house, his gaze lingering on the now mended roof and the sturdy porch. "We should give it a name," he said quietly. "The farm." Annelise leaned her head on his shoulder. She looked at Leo, who was tracing a pattern in the dust with his finger, humming a little tune she had taught him. She looked at the strong, gentle man beside her, whose hand was a warm, steady anchor in hers. "We already have," she said. "We call it home." Their life was built on a foundation of quiet vows, spoken not in a church, but in the daily acts of their life together. The promise was in the way he brought her the first ripe tomato from the garden, its skin warm from the sun. It was in the way she laid out his clean work clothes each morning before dawn. It was in the sound of Leo's laughter, a sound that now filled the small house, chasing the last of the sad, lonely shadows from the corners. Their intimacy was a language of gestures. A hand on the small of her back as they passed in the narrow hall. The way he would tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The simple, profound act of sitting on the edge of the bed and helping each other unlace their dusty boots at the end of a long day. One evening, she was finishing some paperwork for the farm, her fingers smudged with ink. Elias came and sat beside her, taking her hand. He poured a little water into a basin and, with a soft cloth, carefully and patiently washed the ink from her skin, his touch as reverent as a prayer. In that simple act of aftercare, she saw the entirety of their love story. His steadfastness, his gentle service, his unwavering devotion. He was a man who mended what was broken, who tended to what was hurt, and who protected what he cherished. The predator, Silas Croft, was a fading memory, a foil that had served only to highlight the rare and precious quality of Elias's honor. He had tried to use her past as a weapon, but Elias and Annelise had refused to be wounded by it. They had built their future on a different set of terms: respect, autonomy, and a love that was chosen every single day. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of a family, the murmur of stories being read aloud, the clatter of plates, the easy conversation that flowed between two people who knew each other's hearts. The lamp on the kitchen table no longer illuminated a lonely vigil. It lit a shared meal, a shared life. Elias took the carved bird from the mantelpiece and, with his knife, carefully etched a date on the bottom, the day they had faced Croft together. He handed it back to Annelise. It was not a wedding ring, but it was their token, a symbol of their true beginning. She took it, her hand closing around it, and then she reached for his, holding it tight. They were home.